This is a continuation of O Pioneers by Willa Cather, comprising Part 2, Chapters 3 through 6. Part 2, Chapter 3. Alexandra was to hear more of Ivor's case, however. On Sunday her married brothers came to dinner. She had asked them for that day because Emile, who hated family parties, would be absent, dancing at Amédée Chevalier's wedding, up in the French country. The table was set for company in the dining room, where highly varnished wood and colored glass and useless pieces of china were conspicuous enough to satisfy the standards of the new prosperity. Alexandra had put herself into the hands of the Hanover furniture dealer, and he had conscientiously done his best to make her dining room look like his display window. She said frankly that she knew nothing about such things, and she was willing to be governed by the general conviction that the more useless and utterly unusable objects were, the greater their virtue as ornament. That seemed reasonable enough. Since she liked plain things herself, it was all the more necessary to have jars and punch bowls and candlesticks in the company rooms for people who did appreciate them. Her guests liked to see about them these reassuring emblems of prosperity. The family party was complete except for Emile, and Oscar's wife who, in the country phrase, was not going anywhere just now. Oscar sat at the foot of the table and his 4 tow-headed little boys, aged from 12 to 5, were ranged at one side. Neither Oscar nor Lou has changed much, they have simply, as Alexandra said of them long ago, grown to be more and more like themselves. Lou now looks the older of the two, his face is thin and shrewd and wrinkled about the eyes, while Oscar's is thick and dull. For all his dullness, however, Oscar makes more money than his brother, which adds to Lou's sharpness and uneasiness and tempts him to make a show. The trouble with Lou is that he is tricky, and his neighbors have found out that, as Ivor says, he is not a fox's face for nothing. Politics being the natural field for such talents, he neglects his farm to attend conventions and to run for county offices. Lou's wife, formerly Annie Lee, has grown to look curiously like her husband. Her face has become longer, sharper, more aggressive. She wears her yellow hair in a high pompadour, and is bedecked with rings and chains and beauty pins. Her tight, high-heeled shoes give her an awkward walk, and she is always more or less preoccupied with her clothes. As she sat at the table, she kept telling her youngest daughter to be careful now, and not drop anything on Mother. The conversation at the table was all in English. Oscar's wife, from the malaria district of Missouri, was ashamed of marrying a foreigner, and his boys do not understand a word of Swedish. Annie and Lou sometimes speak Swedish at home, but Annie is almost as much afraid of being caught at it as ever her mother was of being caught barefoot. Oscar still has a thick accent, but Lou speaks like anybody from Iowa. When I was in Hastings to attend the convention, he was saying, I saw the superintendent of the asylum, and I was telling him about Ivor's symptoms. He says Ivor's case is one of the most dangerous kind, and it's a wonder he hasn't done something violent before this. Alexandra laughed good-humoredly. Oh, nonsense, Lou. The doctors would have us all crazy if they could. Ivar's queer, certainly, but he has more sense than half the hands I hire. Lou flew at his fried chicken. Oh, I guess the doctor knows his business, Alexandra. He was very much surprised when I told him how you'd put up with Ivar. He says he's likely to set fire to the barn any night, or to take after you and the girls with an axe. Little Signa, who was waiting on the table, giggled and fled to the kitchen. Alexandra's eyes twinkled. That was too much for Signa, Lou. We all know that Ivar's perfectly harmless. The girls would as soon expect me to chase them with an axe. Lou flushed and signaled to his wife. All the same, the neighbors will be having a say about it before long. He may burn anybody's barn. It's only necessary for one property owner in the township to make complaint, and he'll be taken up by force. You'd better send him yourself and not have any hard feelings. Alexandra helped one of her little nephews to gravy. Well, Lou, if any of the neighbors try that, I'll have myself appointed Ivor's guardian and take the case to court. That's all. I am perfectly satisfied with him. Pass the preserves, Lou, said Annie in a warning tone. She had reasons for not wishing her husband to cross Alexandra too openly. But don't you sort of hate to have people see him around here, Alexandra? She went on with persuasive smoothness. He is a disgraceful object, and you're fixed up so nice now. It sort of makes people distant with you, when they never know when they'll hear him scratching about. My girls are afraid as death of him, aren't you, Millie, dear? Millie was 15, fat and jolly and pompadoured, with a creamy complexion, square white teeth, and a short upper lip. She looked like her grandmother Bergson, and had her comfortable and comfort-loving nature. She grinned at her aunt, with whom she was a great deal more at ease than she was with her mother. Alexandra winked a reply. Millie needn't be afraid of Ivar. She's an especial favorite of his. In my opinion, Ivar has just as much right to his own way of dressing and thinking as we have. But I'll see that he doesn't bother other people. I'll keep him at home, so don't trouble any more about him, Lou. I've been wanting to ask you about your new bathtub. How does it work? Annie came to the fore to give Lou time to recover himself. Oh, it works something grand. I can't keep him out of it. He washes himself all over 3 times a week now, and uses all the hot water. I think it's weakening to stay in as long as he does. You ought to have one, Alexandra. I'm thinking of it. I might have one put in the barn for Ivar if it will ease people's minds. But before I get a bathtub, I'm going to get a piano for Millie. Oscar, at the end of the table, looked up from his plate. What does Millie want of a peony? What's the matter with her organ? She can make some use of that and play in church. Annie looked flustered. She had begged Alexandra not to say anything about this plan before Oscar, who was apt to be jealous of what his sister did for Lou's children. Alexandra did not get on with Oscar's wife at all. Millie can play in church just the same, and she'll still play on the organ. But practicing on it so much spoils her touch. Her teacher says so, Annie brought out with spirit. Oscar rolled his eyes. Well, Millie must have got on pretty good if she's got past the organ. I know plenty of grown folks that ain't, he said bluntly. Annie threw up her chin. She has got on good, and she's going to play for her commencement when she graduates in town next year. Yes, said Alexandra firmly. I think Millie deserves a piano. All the girls around here have been taking lessons for years, but Millie is the only one of them who can ever play anything when you ask her. I'll tell you when I first thought I would like to give you a piano, Millie, and that was when you learned that book of old Swedish songs that your grandfather used to sing. He had a sweet tenor voice, and when he was a young man he loved to sing. I can remember hearing him singing with the sailors down in the shipyard, when I was no bigger than Stella here, pointing to Annie's younger daughter. Millie and Stella both looked through the door into the sitting room, where a crayon portrait of John Bergson hung on the wall. Alexandra had had it made from a little photograph, taken for his friends just before he left Sweden. A slender man of 35, with soft hair curling about his high forehead, a drooping mustache, and wondering, sad eyes that looked forward into the distance, as if they already beheld the new world. After dinner, Lou and Oscar went to the orchard to pick cherries. They had neither of them had the patience to grow an orchard of their own, and Annie went down to gossip with Alexandra's kitchen girls while they washed the dishes. She could always find out more about Alexandra's domestic economy from the prattling maids than from Alexandra herself, and what she discovered she used to her own advantage with Lou. On the Divide, farmers' daughters no longer went out into service, so Alexandra got her girls from Sweden by paying their fare over. They stayed with her until they married and were replaced by sisters or cousins from the old country. Alexandra took her 3 nieces into the flower garden. She was fond of the little girls, especially of Millie, who came to spend a week with her aunt now and then, and read aloud to her from the old books about the house, or listen to stories about the early days on the Divide. While they were walking among the flower beds, a buggy drove up the hill and stopped in front of the gate. A man got out and stood talking to the driver. The little girls were delighted at the advent of a stranger, someone from very far away. They knew by his clothes, his gloves, and the sharp, pointed cut of his dark beard. The girls fell behind their aunt and peeped out at him from among the castor beans. The stranger came up to the gate and stood holding his hat in his hand, smiling, while Alexandra advanced slowly to meet him. As she approached, he spoke in a low, pleasant voice. "Don't you know me, Alexandra? I would have known you anywhere." Alexandra shaded her eyes with her hand. Suddenly she took a quick step forward. "Can it be?" she exclaimed with feeling. "Can it be that it is Carl Lindstrom? Why, Carl, it is?" She threw out both her hands and caught his across the gate. "Sadie, Millie, run tell your father and Uncle Oscar that our old friend Carl Lindstrom is here. Be quick. Why, Carl, how did it happen? I can't believe this." Alexandra shook the tears from her eyes and laughed. The stranger nodded to his driver, dropped his suitcase inside the fence, and opened the gate. "Then you are glad to see me, and you can put me up overnight. I couldn't go through this country without stopping off to have a look at you. How little you have changed. Do you know, I was sure it would be like that. You simply couldn't be different. How fine you are." He stepped back and looked at her admiringly. Alexandra blushed and laughed again. "But you yourself, Carl, with that beard, how could I have known you?" "You went away a little boy." She reached for his suitcase, and when he intercepted her, she threw up her hands. "You see, I give myself away. I have only women come to visit me, and I do not know how to behave. Where is your trunk?" "It's in Hanover. I can stay only a few days. I am on my way to the coast." They started up the path. "A few days? After all these years?" Alexandra shook her finger at him. "See this, you have walked into a trap. You do not get away so easy." She put her hand affectionately on his shoulder. "You owe me a visit for the sake of old times. Why must you go to the coast at all?" "Oh, I must. I am a fortune hunter. From Seattle I go on to Alaska." "Alaska?" She looked at him in astonishment. "Are you going to paint the Indians?" "Paint?" The young man frowned. "Oh, I'm not a painter, Alexandra. I'm an engraver. I have nothing to do with painting. But on my parlor wall I have the paintings." He interrupted nervously. "Oh, watercolor sketches done for amusement. I sent them to remind you of me, not because they were good. What a wonderful place you have made of this, Alexandra." He turned and looked back at the wide, map-like prospect of field and hedge and pasture. "I would never have believed it could be done. I'm disappointed in my own eye and my imagination." At this moment Lou and Oscar came up the hill from the orchard. They did not quicken their pace when they saw Carl. Indeed, they did not openly look in his direction. They advanced distrustfully, and as if they wished the distance were longer. Alexandra beckoned to them. "They think I am trying to fool them. Come, boys, it's Carl Lindstrom, our old Carl." Lou gave the visitor a quick, sidelong glance and thrust out his hand. "Glad to see you." Oscar followed with "How do you?" Carl could not tell whether their offishness came from unfriendliness or from embarrassment. He and Alexandra led the way to the porch. "Carl," Alexandra explained, "is on his way to Seattle. He is going to Alaska." Oscar studied the visitor's yellow shoes. "Got business there?" he asked. Carl laughed. "Yes, very pressing business. I'm going there to get rich. Engraving's a very interesting profession, but a man never makes any money at it. So I'm going to try the goldfields." Alexandra felt that this was a tactful speech, and Lou looked up with some interest. "Ever done anything in that line before?" "No, but I'm going to join a friend of mine who went out from New York and has done well. He has offered to break me in." "Terrible cold winters there, I hear," remarked Oscar. "I thought people went up there in the spring." "They do. But my friend is going to spend the winter in Seattle, and I am to stay with him there and learn something about prospecting before we start north next year." Lou looked skeptical. "Let's see, how long have you been away from here?" 16 years. You ought to remember that, Lou, for you were married just after we went away." "Going to stay with us some time?" Oscar asked. "A few days, if Alexandra can keep me." "I expect you'll be wanting to see your old place," Lou observed more cordially. "You won't hardly know it. But there's a few chunks of your old sod house left." Annie Lee, who, ever since the visitor was announced, had been touching up her hair and settling her lace and wishing she had worn another dress, now emerged with her 3 daughters and introduced them. She was greatly impressed by Carl's urban appearance, and in her excitement talked very loud and threw her head about. "And you ain't married yet? At your age? Now? Think of that, you'll have to wait for Millie." "Yes, we've got a boy too. The youngest. He's at home with his grandma. You must come over to see Mother and hear Millie play. She's the musician of the family. She does pyrography too. That's burnt wood, you know. You wouldn't believe what she can do with her poker. Yes, she goes to school in town, and she is the youngest in her class by 2 years." Millie looked uncomfortable, and Carl took her hand again. He liked her creamy skin and happy, innocent eyes, and he could see that her mother's way of talking distressed her. "I'm sure she's a clever little girl," he murmured, looking at her thoughtfully. "Let me see. Ah, it's your mother that she looks like, Alexandra. Mrs. Bergson must have looked just like this when she was a little girl. Does Millie run about over the country as you and Alexandra used to, Annie?" Millie's mother protested. "Oh my, no. Things has changed since we was girls. Millie has it very different. We are going to rent the place and move into town as soon as the girls are old enough to go out into company. A good many are doing that here now. Lou is going into business." Lou grinned. "That's what she says. You better go get your things on. Ivar's hitching up, he added, turning to Annie. Young farmers seldom address their wives by name. It is always you or she. Having got his wife out of the way, Lou sat down on the step and began to whittle. Well, what do folks in New York think of William Jennings Bryan? Lou began to bluster, as he always did when he talked politics. We gave Wall Street a scare in '96, all right, and we're fixing another to hand them. Silver wasn't the only issue, he nodded mysteriously. There's a good many things got to be changed. The West is going to make itself heard. Carl laughed. But surely it did do that, if nothing else. Lou's thin face reddened up to the roots of his bristly hair. Oh, we've only begun. We're waking up to a sense of our responsibilities out here, and we ain't afraid neither. You fellows back there must be a tame lot. If you had any nerve, you'd get together and march down to Wall Street and blow it up. Dynamite it, I mean, with a threatening nod. He was so much in earnest that Carl scarcely knew how to answer him. That would be a waste of powder. The same business would go on in another street. The street doesn't matter. But what have you fellows out here got to kick about? You have the only safe place there is. Morgan himself couldn't touch you. One only has to drive through this country to see that you're all as rich as barons. We have a good deal more to say than we had when we were poor, said Lou threateningly. We're getting onto a whole lot of things. As Ivar drove a double carriage up to the gate, Annie came out in a hat that looked like the model of a battleship. Carl rose and took her down to the carriage, while Lou lingered for a word with his sister. What do you suppose he's come for? He asked, jerking his head toward the gate. Why, to pay us a visit. I've been begging him to for years. Oscar looked at Alexandra. He didn't let you know he was coming. No, why should he? I told him to come at any time. Lou shrugged his shoulders. He doesn't seem to have done much for himself, wandering around this way. Oscar spoke solemnly, as from the depths of a cavern. He never was much account. Alexandra left them and hurried down to the gate, where Annie was rattling on to Carl about her new dining room furniture. You must bring Mr. Lindstrom over real soon, only be sure to telephone me first, she called back, as Carl helped her into the carriage. Old Ivar, his white head bare, stood holding the horses. Lou came down the path and climbed into the front seat, took up the reins, and drove off without saying anything further to anyone. Oscar picked up his youngest boy and trudged off down the road, the other three trotting after him. Carl, holding the gate open for Alexandra, began to laugh. Up and coming on the divide, Alexandra? He cried gaily. Part 2, Chapter 4. Carl had changed, Alexandra felt, much less than one might have expected. He had not become a trim, self-satisfied city man. There was still something homely and wayward and definitely personal about him. Even his clothes, his Norfolk coat and his very high collars were a little unconventional. He seemed to shrink into himself as he used to do, to hold himself away from things, as if he were afraid of being hurt. In short, he was more self-conscious than a man of 35 is expected to be. He looked older than his years, and not very strong. His black hair, which still hung in a triangle over his pale forehead, was thin at the crown, and there were fine, relentless lines about his eyes. His back, with its high, sharp shoulders, looked like the back of an overworked German professor off on his holiday. His face was intelligent, sensitive, unhappy. That evening after supper, Carl and Alexandra were sitting by the clump of castor beans in the middle of the flower garden. The gravel paths glittered in the moonlight, and below them the fields lay white and still. Do you know, Alexandra, he was saying, I've been thinking how strangely things work out. I've been away engraving other men's pictures, and you've stayed at home and made your own. He pointed with his cigar toward the sleeping landscape. How in the world have you done it? How have your neighbors done it? We hadn't any of us much to do with it, Carl. The land did it. It had its little joke. It pretended to be poor because nobody knew how to work it right. And then, all at once, it worked itself. It woke up out of its sleep and stretched itself, and it was so big, so rich, that we suddenly found we were rich, just from sitting still. As for me, you remember when I began to buy land? For years after that I was always squeezing and borrowing until I was ashamed to show my face in the banks. And then, all at once, men began to come to me offering to lend me money, and I didn't need it. Then I went ahead and built this house. I really built it for Emil. I want you to see Emil, Carl. He is so different from the rest of us. How different? Oh, you'll see. I'm sure it was to have sons like Emil, and to give them a chance, that father left the old country. It's curious, too, on the outside Emil is just like an American boy. He graduated from the State University in June, but underneath he is more Swedish than any of us. Sometimes he is so like father that he frightens me. He is so violent in his feelings like that. Is he going to farm here with you? He shall do whatever he wants to, Alexandra declared warmly. He is going to have a chance, a whole chance. That's what I've worked for. Sometimes he talks about studying law, and sometimes just lately he's been talking about going out into the sand hills and taking up more land. He has his sad times like father. But I hope he won't do that. We have land enough, at last. Alexandra laughed. How about Lou and Oscar? They've done well, haven't they? Yes, very well, but they are different, and now that they have farms of their own, I do not see so much of them. We divided the land equally when Lou married. They have their own way of doing things, and they do not altogether like my way, I am afraid. Perhaps they think me too independent, but I have had to think for myself a good many years, and am not likely to change. On the whole, though, we take as much comfort in each other as most brothers and sisters do, and I am very fond of Lou's oldest daughter. I think I like the old Lou and Oscar better, and they probably feel the same about me. If you can keep a secret, Carl leaned forward and touched her arm, smiling. I even think I like the old country better. This is all very splendid in its way, but there was something about this country when it was a wild old beast that has haunted me all these years. Now, when I come back to all this milk and honey, I feel like the old German song, wo bist du, mein geliebtes Land. Do you ever feel like that, I wonder? Yes, sometimes, when I think about father and mother and those who are gone, so many of our old neighbors. Alexandra paused and looked up thoughtfully at the stars. We can remember the graveyard when it was wild prairie, Carl, and now. And now the old story has begun to write itself over there, said Carl softly. Isn't it queer there are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before, like the larks in this country that have been singing the same 5 notes over for thousands of years. Oh yes, the young people, they live so hard, and yet I sometimes envy them. There is my little neighbor now, the people who bought your old place. I wouldn't have sold it to anyone else, but I was always fond of that girl. You must remember her, little Marie Tevesky, from Omaha, who used to visit here. When she was 18, she ran away from the convent school and got married. Crazy child. She came out here a bride with her father and husband. He had nothing, and the old man was willing to buy them a place and set them up. Your farm took her fancy, and I was glad to have her so near me. I've never been sorry either. I even try to get along with Frank on her account. Is Frank her husband? Yes, he's one of these wild fellows. Most Bohemians are good-natured, but Frank thinks we don't appreciate him here, I guess. He's jealous about everything, his farm and his horses and his pretty wife. Everybody likes her just the same as when she was little. Sometimes I go up to the Catholic church with Emile, and it's funny to see Marie standing there laughing and shaking hands with people, looking so excited and gay, with Frank sulking behind her as if he could eat everybody alive. Frank's not a bad neighbor, but to get on with him you've got to make a fuss over him and act as if you thought he was a very important person all the time, and different from other people. I find it hard to keep that up from one year's end to another. I shouldn't think you'd be very successful at that kind of thing, Alexandra. Carl seemed to find the idea amusing. Well, said Alexandra firmly, I do the best I can on Marie's account. She has it hard enough anyway. She's too young and pretty for this sort of life. We're all ever so much older and slower. But she's the kind that won't be downed easily. She'll work all day and go to a bohemian wedding and dance all night, and drive the hay wagon for a crossman next morning. I could stay by a job, but I never had the go in me that she has when I was going my best. I'll have to take you over to see her tomorrow. Carl dropped the end of his cigar softly among the castor beans and sighed. Yes, I suppose I must see the old place. I'm cowardly about things that remind me of myself. It took courage to come at all, Alexandra. I wouldn't have, if I hadn't wanted to see you very, very much. Alexandra looked at him with her calm, deliberate eyes. Why do you dread things like that, Carl? She asked earnestly. Why are you dissatisfied with yourself? Her visitor winced. How direct you are, Alexandra. Just like you used to be. Do I give myself away so quickly? Well, you see, for one thing, there's nothing to look forward to in my profession. Wood engraving is the only thing I care about, and that had gone out before I began. Everything's cheap metalwork nowadays, touching up miserable photographs, forcing up poor drawings, and spoiling good ones. I'm absolutely sick of it all. Carl frowned. Alexandra, all the way out from New York I've been planning how I could deceive you and make you think me a very enviable fellow, and here I am telling you the truth the first night. I waste a lot of time pretending to people, and the joke of it is I don't think I ever deceive anyone. There are too many of my kind, people know us on sight. Carl paused. Alexandra pushed her hair back from her brow with a puzzled, thoughtful gesture. You see, he went on calmly, measured by your standards here, I'm a failure. I couldn't buy even one of your cornfields. I've enjoyed a great many things, but I've got nothing to show for it all. But you show for it yourself, Carl. I'd rather have had your freedom than my land. Carl shook his head mournfully. Freedom so often means that one isn't needed anywhere. Here you are an individual, you have a background of your own, you would be missed. But off there in the cities there are thousands of rolling stones like me. We are all alike. We have no ties, we know nobody, we own nothing. When one of us dies, they scarcely know where to bury him. Our landlady and the delicatessen man are our mourners, and we leave nothing behind us but a frock coat and a fiddle, or an easel, or a typewriter, or whatever tool we got our living by. All we have ever managed to do is to pay our rent, the exorbitant rent that one has to pay for a few square feet of space near the heart of things. We have no house, no place, no people of our own. We live in the streets, in the parks, in the theaters. We sit in restaurants and concert halls and look about at the hundreds of our own kind and shudder. Alexandra was silent. She sat looking at the silver spot the moon made on the surface of the pond down in the pasture. He knew that she understood what he meant. At last she said slowly, and yet I would rather have Emil grow up like that than like his two brothers. We pay a high rent too, though we pay differently. We grow hard and heavy here. We don't move lightly and easily as you do, and our minds get stiff. If the world were no wider than my cornfields, if there were not something beside this, I wouldn't feel that it was much worthwhile to work. No, I would rather have Emil like you than like them. I felt that as soon as you came. I wonder why you feel like that, Carl mused. I don't know. Perhaps I am like Carrie Jensen, the sister of one of my hired men. She had never been out of the cornfields, and a few years ago she got despondent and said life was just the same thing over and over, and she didn't see the use of it. After she had tried to kill herself once or twice, her folks got worried and sent her over to Iowa to visit some relations. Ever since she's come back, she's been perfectly cheerful, and she says she's contented to live and work in a world that's so big and interesting. She said that anything as big as the bridges over the Platte and the Missouri reconciled her, and it's what goes on in the world that reconciles me. Part 2, Chapter 5. Alexandra did not find time to go to her neighbors the next day, nor the next. It was a busy season on the farm, with the corn plowing going on, and even Emil was in the field with a team and cultivator. Carl went about over the farms with Alexandra in the morning, and in the afternoon and evening they found a great deal to talk about. Emil, for all his track practice, did not stand up under farm work very well, and by night he was too tired to talk, or even to practice on his cornet. On Wednesday morning Carl got up before it was light, and stole downstairs and out of the kitchen door just as old Ivar was making his morning ablutions at the pump. Carl nodded to him and hurried up the draw, past the garden, and into the pasture where the milking cows used to be kept. The dawn in the east looked like the light from some great fire that was burning under the edge of the world. The color was reflected in the globules of dew that sheathed the short gray pasture grass. Carl walked rapidly until he came to the crest of the second hill, where the Bergson pasture joined the one that had belonged to his father. There he sat down and waited for the sun to rise. It was just there that he and Alexandra used to do their milking together, he on his side of the fence, she on hers. He could remember exactly how she looked when she came over the close-cropped grass, her skirts pinned up, her head bare, a bright tin pail in either hand, and the milky light of the early morning all about her. Even as a boy he used to feel, when he saw her coming with her free step, her upright head and calm shoulders, that she looked as if she had walked straight out of the morning itself. Since then, when he had happened to see the sun come up in the country or on the water, he had often remembered the young Swedish girl and her milking pails. Carl sat musing until the sun leaped above the prairie, and in the grass about him all the small creatures of day began to tune their tiny instruments. Birds and insects without number began to chirp, to twitter, to snap, and whistle, to make all manner of fresh, shrill noises. The pasture was flooded with light, every clump of ironweed, and snow on the mountain threw a long shadow, and the golden light seemed to be rippling through the curly grass like the tide racing in. He crossed the fence into the pasture that was now the Shabatas and continued his walk toward the pond. He had not gone far, however, when he discovered that he was not the only person abroad. In the draw below, his gun in his hands, was Emil, advancing cautiously with a young woman beside him. They were moving softly, keeping close together, and Carl knew that they expected to find ducks on the pond. At the moment when they came in sight of the bright spot of water, he heard a whir of wings and the ducks shot up into the air. There was a sharp crack from the gun, and 5 of the birds fell to the ground. Emil and his companion laughed delightedly, and Emil ran to pick them up. When he came back, dangling the ducks by their feet, Marie held her apron and he dropped them into it. As she stood looking down at them, her face changed. She took up one of the birds, a rumpled ball of feathers, with the blood dripping slowly from its mouth, and looked at the live color that still burned on its plumage. As she let it fall, she cried in distress, "Oh, Emil, why did you?" "I like that," the boy exclaimed indignantly. "Why, Marie, you asked me to come yourself." Yes, I know," she said tearfully, "but I didn't think. I hate to see them when they are first shot. They were having such a good time, and we've spoiled it all for them." Emil gave a rather sore laugh. "I should say we had. I'm not going hunting with you anymore. You're as bad as Ivor. Here, let me take them." He snatched the ducks out of her apron. "Don't be cross, Emil. Only Ivar's right about wild things. They're too happy to kill. You can tell just how they felt when they flew up. They were scared, but they didn't really think anything could hurt them. No, we won't do that anymore." "All right," Emil assented. "I'm sorry I made you feel bad." As he looked down into her tearful eyes, there was a curious, sharp young bitterness in his own. Carl watched them as they moved slowly down the draw. They had not seen him at all. He had not overheard much of their dialogue, but he felt the import of it. It made him somehow unreasonably mournful to find 2 young things abroad in the pasture in the early morning. He decided that he needed his breakfast. Part 2, Chapter 6. At dinner that day, Alexandra said she thought they must really manage to go over to the Shabatas that afternoon. "It's not often I let 3 days go by without seeing Marie. She will think I have forsaken her, now that my old friend has come back." After the men had gone back to work, Alexandra put on a white dress and her sun hat, and she and Carl set forth across the fields. "You see, we have kept up the old path, Carl. It has been so nice for me to feel that there was a friend at the other end of it again." Carl smiled a little ruefully. "All the same, I hope it hasn't been quite the same." Alexandra looked at him with surprise. "Why, no, of course not. Not the same. She could not very well take your place, if that's what you mean. I'm friendly with all my neighbors, I hope. But Marie is really a companion, someone I can talk to quite frankly. You wouldn't want me to be more lonely than I have been, would you?" Carl laughed and pushed back the triangular lock of hair with the edge of his hat. "Of course I don't. I ought to be thankful that this path hasn't been worn by friends with more pressing errands than your little bohemian is likely to have." He paused to give Alexandra his hand as she stepped over the stile. "Are you the least bit disappointed in our coming together again?" he asked abruptly. "Is it the way you hoped it would be?" Alexandra smiled at this. "Only better. When I've thought about your coming, I've sometimes been a little afraid of it. You have lived where things move so fast and everything is slow here, the people slowest of all. Our lives are like the years, all made up of weather and crops and cows. How you hated cows." She shook her head and laughed to herself. "I didn't when we milked together. I walked up to the pasture corners this morning. I wonder whether I shall ever be able to tell you all that I was thinking about up there. It's a strange thing, Alexandra. I find it easy to be frank with you about everything under the sun except yourself." "You are afraid of hurting my feelings, perhaps." Alexandra looked at him thoughtfully. "No, I'm afraid of giving you a shock. You've seen yourself for so long in the dull minds of the people about you, that if I were to tell you how you seem to me, it would startle you. But you must see that you astonish me. You must feel when people admire you." Alexandra blushed and laughed with some confusion. "I felt that you were pleased with me, if you mean that." "And you felt when other people were pleased with you," he insisted. "Well, sometimes. The men in town, at the banks and the county offices, seem glad to see me. I think myself it is more pleasant to do business with people who are clean and healthy looking," she admitted blandly. Carl gave a little chuckle as he opened the Shabatas gate for her. "Oh, do you?" he asked dryly. There was no sign of life about the Shabatish house, except a big yellow cat, sunning itself on the kitchen doorstep. Alexandra took the path that led to the orchard. She often sits there and sews. I didn't telephone her we were coming, because I didn't want her to go to work and bake cake and freeze ice cream. She'll always make a party if you give her the least excuse. Do you recognize the apple trees, Carl? Lindstrom looked about him. I wish I had $1 for every bucket of water I've carried for those trees. Poor father, he was an easy man, but he was perfectly merciless when it came to watering the orchard. That's one thing I like about Germans. They make an orchard grow if they can't make anything else. I'm so glad these trees belong to someone who takes comfort in them. When I rented this place, the tenants never kept the orchard up, and Emil and I used to come over and take care of it ourselves. It needs mowing now. There she is down in the corner. Maria A.A., she called. A recumbent figure started up from the grass and came running toward them through the flickering screen of light and shade. Look at her. Isn't she like a little brown rabbit? Alexandra laughed. Maria ran up panting and threw her arms about Alexandra. Oh, I had begun to think you were not coming at all, maybe. I knew you were so busy. Yes, Emil told me about Mr. Lindstrom being here. Won't you come up to the house? Why not sit down there in your corner? Carl wants to see the orchard. He kept all these trees alive for years, watering them with his own back. Marie turned to Carl. Then I'm thankful to you, Mr. Lindstrom. We'd never have bought the place if it hadn't been for this orchard. And then I wouldn't have had Alexandra, either. She gave Alexandra's arm a little squeeze as she walked beside her. How nice your dress smells, Alexandra. You put rosemary leaves in your chest, like I told you. She led them to the northwest corner of the orchard, sheltered on one side by a thick mulberry hedge and bordered on the other by a wheat field, just beginning to yellow. In this corner the ground dipped a little, and the blue grass, which the weeds had driven out in the upper part of the orchard, grew thick and luxuriant. Wild roses were flaming in the tufts of bunch grass along the fence. Under a white mulberry tree there was an old wagon seat. Beside it lay a book and a work basket. You must have the seat, Alexandra. The grass would stain your dress, the hostess insisted. She dropped down on the ground at Alexandra's side and tucked her feet under her. Carl sat at a little distance from the two women, his back to the wheat field, and watched them. Alexandra took off her shade hat and threw it on the ground. Marie picked it up and played with the white ribbons, twisting them about her brown fingers as she talked. They made a pretty picture in the strong sunlight, the leafy pattern surrounding them like a net, the Swedish woman so white and gold, kindly and amused, but armored in calm, and the alert brown one, her full lips parted, points of yellow light dancing in her eyes as she laughed and chattered. Carl had never forgotten little Marie Tversky's eyes, and he was glad to have an opportunity to study them. The brown iris he found was curiously slashed with yellow, the color of sunflower honey or of old amber. In each eye one of these streaks must have been larger than the others, for the effect was that of two dancing points of light, two little yellow bubbles, such as rise in a glass of champagne. Sometimes they seemed like the sparks from a forge. She seemed so easily excited, to kindle with a fierce little flame if one but breathed upon her. What a waste, Carl reflected. She ought to be doing all that for a sweetheart. How awkwardly things come about. It was not very long before Marie sprang up out of the grass again. Wait a moment. I want to show you something. She ran away and disappeared behind the low-growing apple trees. What a charming creature, Carl murmured. I don't wonder that her husband is jealous. But can't she walk? Does she always run? Alexandra nodded. Always. I don't see many people, but I don't believe there are many like her, anywhere. Marie came back with a branch she had broken from an apricot tree, laden with pale yellow, pink-cheeked fruit. She dropped it beside Carl. Did you plant those too? They are such beautiful little trees. Carl fingered the blue-green leaves, porous like blotting paper and shaped like birch leaves, hung on waxen red stems. Yes, I think I did. Are these the circus trees, Alexandra? Shall I tell her about them? Alexandra asked. Sit down like a good girl, Marie, and don't ruin my poor hat, and I'll tell you a story. A long time ago, when Carl and I were, say, 16 and 12, a circus came to Hanover, and we went to town in our wagon, with Lou and Oscar, to see the parade. We hadn't money enough to go to the circus. We followed the parade out to the circus grounds and hung around until the show began and the crowd went inside the tent. Then Louisiana was afraid we looked foolish standing outside in the pasture, so we went back to Hanover feeling very sad. There was a man in the streets selling apricots, and we had never seen any before. He had driven down from somewhere up in the French country, and he was selling them 25 cents a peck. We had a little money our fathers had given us for candy, and I bought 2 pecks and Carl bought one. They cheered us a good deal, and we saved all the seeds and planted them. Up to the time Carl went away, they hadn't borne at all. And now he's come back to eat them, cried Marie, nodding at Carl. That is a good story. I can remember you a little, Mr. Lindstrom. I used to see you in Hanover sometimes, when Uncle Joe took me to town. I remember you because you were always buying pencils and tubes of paint at the drugstore. Once, when my uncle left me at the store, you drew a lot of little birds and flowers for me on a piece of wrapping paper. I kept them for a long while. I thought you were very romantic because you could draw and had such black eyes. Carl smiled. Yes, I remember that time. Your uncle bought you some kind of a mechanical toy, a Turkish lady sitting on an ottoman and smoking a hookah, wasn't it? And she turned her head backwards and forwards. Oh yes, wasn't she splendid? I knew well enough I ought not to tell Uncle Joe I wanted it, for he had just come back from the saloon and was feeling good. You remember how he laughed? She tickled him too. But when we got home, my aunt scolded him for buying toys when she needed so many things. We wound our lady up every night, and when she began to move her head, my aunt used to laugh, as hard as any of us. It was a music box, you know, and the Turkish lady played a tune while she smoked. That was how she made you feel so jolly. As I remember her, she was lovely, and had a gold crescent on her turban. Half an hour later, as they were leaving the house, Carl and Alexandra were met in the path by a strapping fellow in overalls and a blue shirt. He was breathing hard, as if he had been running, and was muttering to himself. Marie ran forward, and, taking him by the arm, gave him a little push toward her guests. Frank, this is Mr. Lindstrom. Frank took off his broad straw hat and nodded to Alexandra. When he spoke to Carl, he showed a fine set of white teeth. He was burned a dull red down to his neckband, and there was a heavy 3 days' stubble on his face. Even in his agitation he was handsome, but he looked a rash and violent man. Barely saluting the callers, he turned at once to his wife and began, in an outraged tone, I have to leave my team to drive the old woman Hiller's hogs out of my wheat. I go to take dat old woman to de court if she ain't careful, I tell you. His wife spoke soothingly. But, Frank, she has only her lame boy to help her. She does the best she can. Alexandra looked at the excited man and offered a suggestion. Why don't you go over there some afternoon and hog tighter fences? You'd save time for yourself in the end. Frank's neck stiffened. Not a much I won't. I keep my hogs home. Other people's can do like me. See? If that Louis can mend shoes, he can mend fence. Maybe, said Alexandra placidly, but I found it sometimes pays to mend other people's fences. Goodbye, Marie. Come to see me soon. Alexandra walked firmly down the path and Carl followed her. Frank went into the house and threw himself on the sofa, his face to the wall, his clenched fist on his hip. Marie, having seen her guests off, came in and put her hand coaxingly on his shoulder. Poor Frank, you've run until you've made your head ache, now haven't you? Let me make you some coffee. What else am I to do? He cried hotly in Bohemian. Am I to let any old woman's hogs root up my wheat? Is that what I work myself to death for? Don't worry about it, Frank. I'll speak to Mrs. Hiller again. But really, she almost cried last time they got out, she was so sorry. Frank bounced over on his other side. That's it, you always side with them against me. They all know it. Anybody here feels free to borrow the mower and break it, or turn their hogs in on me. They know you won't care. Marie hurried away to make his coffee. When she came back, he was fast asleep. She sat down and looked at him for a long while, very thoughtfully. When the kitchen clock struck 6, she went out to get supper, closing the door gently behind her. She was always sorry for Frank when he worked himself into one of these rages, and she was sorry to have him rough and quarrelsome with his neighbors. She was perfectly aware that the neighbors had a good deal to put up with, and that they bore with Frank for her sake. This concludes the third part of 6 total of O Pioneers by Willa Cather, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.